Well, hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam. I have a question I want to try to answer that I've actually been seeing on my Facebook page as I'm scrolling. That it's not even a question, just something that people are posting that's driving me absolutely crazy. And I'm going to try to find it. Maybe I'll put it up right here. But it is a post that's saying warning, and Bible verses have been removed from the newer texts, the newer versions of the Bible, and King James version is the only one that preserves this. And look it up. Here's all these verses, and they especially target the NIV and just like boom, boom, all these verses. Like, look at how they're changing the Word of God and all this kind of stuff. And so I just want to talk about this now. A majority of you probably who watch my channel know that what's going on here, and you're like, well, yeah, of course. But there are a large group of people who don't and who are just buying in hook, line, and sinker to this misinformation, and it's just driving me crazy. So I want to try to help. I have charts. I have all kinds of stuff. I have pictures of fragment pieces. I want to show you how this all works. But I think, for some of you, this might just be a refresher. And this might even be like hey, I already knew all of that. And then for others of us, this might be like brand new information and maybe very helpful to help you combat this misinformation that's coming to show you, hey, look, there's a lot of versions of the English Bible, translations of the English Bible, and nobody is being underhanded with how they're trying to translate this stuff by taking these things out. In fact, it may be even more close to the original text by taking them out. So let me show you real quick. Okay, so here's the first chart. This first chart, we're going to run to right here. It's a chart that is really the translation history of the English Bible that leads to the King James. Okay, and so we need to understand that before we go to the next, the graph to show you how things changed. Okay, so I'm going to use my little cursor thing right here. See that? We'll be able to see some things here. Okay, so what we have here is you have over here 4th century, late 4th century, early 5th century. Latin Vulgate is completed, and that leads to the Wycliffe Bible in the 1300s. That's a first English translation of the Bible that we have. I think it was handwritten. So yeah, it was fun times there. In the 1500s, though, right? Okay, so the 1500s right here is when everything starts kind of taking off, and when I go to the graph later, you'll see why. But this guy named Erasmus decides that he is going to put together a Greek New Testament. Take all of the manuscripts that he can find, and he's going to put together the Greek New Testament. The legend goes that he had most of it that he could all kind of cobble together from all these different manuscripts. The one thing he did not have, though, as the legend goes, I'm not sure how true this is, but the legend says that he did not have parts of the end of the book of Revelation. And so the story goes that he took the Vulgate and he took the Latin and he translated into Greek and finished the end of his translation. In fact, that's what some people who would say, go against the King James only people that would use that as kind of like, well, anyway, I'm not sure how true that is, but that's the legend anyway. Erasmus then creates his second edition or third edition, the first edition somewhere else. But by the time we get the third edition in 1522, this is what's called the received text, or the Textus Receptus. And this text of the New Testament, we're looking at the New Testament because mostly the things that we're finding are New Testament things, not Old Testament things. Okay, so that version of the Greek New Testament is used to translate the Tyndale New Testament in 1526, okay? And that becomes a really important translation of the Bible here, and then that ends up going into, along with Tyndale's Pentateuch, goes into helping translate the Coverdale Bible down here. There's a lot of other influences and all that kind of stuff, which it all ends up, they take the Tyndale New Testament, the Tyndale Pentateuch, and the Coverdale Bible, and they take all of those things and they make what's called the Matthew's Bible, which is an update to all of those different things. They use all of those to create the Matthew's Bible. The Matthew's Bible gets updated using a lot of these different texts as well, and that becomes the Great Bible. Okay, and the Great Bible is the Matthew's Bible, the Coverdale Bible, the Tyndale Bible. They use all of those to update into the Great Bible, and then they use the Textus Receptus to kind of make sure and check that all of it's, the way it's supposed to be. Well, the Great Bible gets updated into two different sections. One over here to the Bishop's Bible in 1568. But in 1560, the Geneva Bible gets translated, and that uses the Textus Receptus, two other versions of the Greek New Testament and Latin, Greek and Latin here, and then the Great Bible and the Tyndale Bible. All of that is used to create what's called the Geneva Bible. The Bishop's Bible is actually a update of the Great Bible that they use the Geneva Bible and the Tyndale New Testament to kind of make sure that it's accurate. And then from there, it gets updated again in 1611. King James authorizes the King James Version to be an update, a very conservative update of the Bishop's Bible here. And they use, like I said before, they use the Geneva Bible, they use the Tyndale New Testament and the Bishop's Bible in order to do that. There's some rules that they use to make sure that they're editing it and make sure they're translating it correctly. And the rules cover things like footnotes and all that kind of stuff. So notes in the margins, unless it's like some way to explain it, they end up using, and they've done this for most of these, I think, when they have to add a word in that isn't in the Greek text, they will add it in, and it's in italics, and that's how you know it's not actually in the Greek text, but they do it to help make the English flow a little better together. So this is what's called the preserved line of the preserved text. But the problem with this is that our manuscripts from this are not super early. In fact, they're probably they're somewhere like in the, well, let me show you. Okay, so let's go over to the next chart, and I can show you how the manuscripts kind of lay out and how Erasmus did what he did, and what we found later on that helped us understand maybe there's a better way to translate this. Okay, so let's go to what I wanted to show you, and this is the distribution of New Testament manuscripts by century. Okay, so first century, we have 0 manuscripts from the first century, which means we don't have the autographs, the originals, and we don't even have any copies that were made late first century. The majority of the copies of the manuscripts that Erasmus was able to use were probably right here in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. Okay, and having those, and then he also had the Latin Vulgate, okay, which was translated here in the 4th and 5th century, somewhere right here. But you'll notice what we have manuscript-wise, the majority of what we have is right here in this area, which, the King James was done in the 16th century or the 17th century. But the 16th century is when all the magic happened with Erasmus and all that. So here's, look, here are all the manuscripts. Right on time, here comes Erasmus and utilizing all of this. Now, a lot of this stuff on this side over here, we didn't even know we had. Because they hadn't been found yet. And so the Textus Receptus was the Greek translation of the New Testament that was the received text, and it was the one that drove most of the English Bibles all the way up until 1611. Something amazing happened in the 1930s. As they were digging in Alexandria, Egypt, they found a bunch of manuscripts of the New Testament. They found pieces, they found fragments, they found bigger pieces, they found like chunks, like big chunks of books, and they found enough that they were able to reconstruct a version of the New Testament from earlier manuscripts. In fact, we found 4 manuscripts here that were like fragmenty pieces of manuscripts, 47 here in the 3rd century, these like the 200s. 30 here, 17 of the majuscules. I mean, you can look up what these words mean, but we found a bunch, like a ton of stuff here. And what we found in these manuscripts is that there were verses and sections of verses, like the ending of Mark 16, John chapter 7 leading into the beginning of John chapter 8, that they were here in these manuscripts, but they were completely missing in these manuscripts over here. And then what started driving the thought process with some of the scholarship on this, and the textual criticism on this, was, wait a second, we started seeing in these sections here scribal notes editing in some of these verses and editing in some of these things like on the side of the text. And then all of a sudden in the next one, we would see it actually popped in there. And it was not just in the margin anymore. Now it's in the middle of the verse. All right, here I tried to grab just a shot of one of the Codex Alexandrius. And this is when we talk about scribal editing. This is just an example of it. This isn't like, exactly it, but like they'll write things in the margins here or pretty close to here. And sometimes they'll just edit some things in here or maybe the bottom down here. But what would happen is sometimes a scribe would edit here, and then in the next time it was passed on, all of a sudden that made its way into here. Instead of in the margin, all of a sudden it's now in the actual verses. Because notice, there's no chapter headings and there's no verses here. That didn't come till way later. And so it was easy to accidentally slip something in. And I don't think scribes always did, I don't think they did it on purpose or intentionally. I think just sometimes well, what's that doing there? Maybe it belongs in there, kind of a deal. And so then it ends up getting added in. Or they're like, well, this, we like this version of this story, like John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. Maybe that we just need to leave that in because it makes, it's tradition or something like that. Because sometimes it was found in the book of Luke. It wasn't even in John. So anyway, just wanted to show you that real quick. And so when we found these manuscripts here, which are earlier, which are closer to the originals, that didn't have that in there, and then we saw what was going on here that led to these manuscripts, what we started to realize is that maybe they weren't actually in the originals. And so the reason that you don't have some verses in the newer translation is not because somebody's trying to be deceptive and trying to take things out and kind of manipulate the Bible. It's because they're looking at the data and they're saying, okay, the data is showing us in these earlier versions of these manuscripts that these verses likely weren't there to begin with, that they were added in later to either try to make sense of certain things, to carry on a tradition that was being used. Maybe a scribe liked it better than the way it was worded, and so they wrote something in a margin, and then they passed it along, and another scribe just kind of took that and wrote it into the text instead of keeping it on the margin. So what we're seeing in our newer translations is actually probably more accurate to what was originally there, and not just tradition. Now there's a whole set of people who are like gung-ho about keeping with the tradition of the preserved text. I'm going to talk about that in a second after I get out of this and go back to the video. So one of the big issues that I have with this is that have been a group of people that have been doing it for a long time, really kind of railing against the critical text is what it's called, because they are what's called the preserved text. A lot of the times they're King James only, and they will say that the NIV, the ESV, all these other texts are corrupted, and they're not good texts to use. Only the preserved text, the Textus Receptus that led all this, that is the text that is God's word, kind of a deal. And it's just not true. Okay. It is the tradition that they're holding on to, not the data. I think the textual critics who are looking at all this and trying to put these together in the translators, they're really trying to honestly do the best they can to look at the data and say, okay, the data shows us that these texts that are earlier, that were found earlier, don't have this in there. And what we're seeing over time is scribal editing. And so the data would indicate that these verses probably didn't exist in the originals. And so a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take the verse out, or they'll bracket it, or they'll take it out and they'll put it in the footnote. Okay, so these online campaigns to try to get you all worked up and like the King James Bible is the only one that preserves this thing about, God's word. They're trying to just get you worked up because they like the King James, and that's, they think they have an axe to grind against everything else. The issue is that in the NIV especially, they footnote these verses. They tell you in the earliest manuscripts it didn't contain this, but here's what it says, all that kind of stuff. So we have pretty close, I think, to been able to pretty closely reconstruct maybe what the originals may have said. And the good news is any of these verses that are taken out, they really don't do much to like change any kind of doctrinal thing that you would believe about who Jesus is, about God, about what the Bible teaches. Okay, like 99% of what we have in our English translations is like all the same. So there's very minuscule differences. We just need to stop, forwarding on this misinformation, and stop this agenda that's like these texts are terrible. We just need to stop that and realize we are so blessed to have all kinds of English translations. All right. Hopefully this was helpful. Like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.